The city of Corinth that Paul visited in the first century was a city with no long-standing traditions. The old city of Corinth had been destroyed in 146 BCE by the Roman consul Mummius. It had to be rebuilt from the ground up. No longer bound to established customs and beliefs, the Corinthians were free to explore their own ways of living, to manufacture their own beliefs, create their own personal lifestyles, to discover the excitement of reinventing themselves, liberated from memory. In Corinth, history, culture, religion, politics, art, all these things were up for grabs, just waiting to be recreated. It was the city of innovation and novelty. Corinth was where anything could happen. The possibilities were as endless as their buildings were new. If you wanted a fresh start in life, if you wanted to recreate yourself, if you wanted to live your life as creatively as you wanted, if you wanted your parents off your back, you needed to be in Corinth. And people flocked to the city. They came looking for better paying jobs than what they could find back home. They came looking to grab some of the Corinthian prosperity for themselves while it lasted. They came because they didn't want to be pinned down by fossilized expectations and outdated orthodoxies. They had bigger dreams for their lives than what their parents and their families had for them. They wanted their life story to have a different ending than the one that was given to them. They wanted to create that story for themselves. That was Corinthian culture, and people soaked in it. That culture stained on their hearts and their minds as they arrived searching for a new life, a culture Paul found sitting in his pews. Let no one boast about human leaders, Paul says in the ramp up to today's reading. For all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all belong to you and you belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. And he goes on to say this, think of us in this way. Think of us as servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. Paul knew what he was up against. A culture that said, if you weren't going to make something of yourself, no one else will do that for you. If you don't tell your life story, you'll find yourself in someone else's. And it was no wonder the good folks at First Church Corinth couldn't get along. Who is the church to tell them how to live? I create my own world and my own reality, thank you very much. I relate to God in my own way. I don't need some pastor to tell me who God is. I just need the government out of my way so I can do my own thing, raise my children my way, make the living I want to do. No one has any say as to how I live my life except me and how I choose to live it. It's my birthright to make life decisions for myself. I design my own future. I create my own destiny. Sound familiar? I think a 21st century Albertan would be very much at home in first century Corinth. Prosperity and personal choice. That's what we call freedom. But Paul reminds them, you are servants of Christ, not of yourselves. You are stewards of God's mysteries, not your own appetites. Stewards of God's mysteries. I love that phrase, mainly because I have no idea what it means. What do you think when you hear the word steward? In church speak, stewardship usually means money. A stewardship campaign is a euphemism for fundraising. But as soon as people say that, they are quick to add, but stewardship is not just about money, lest they leave the impression that Christians are only interested in people's bank accounts and not the state of their souls. Or we think of the stewardship of the earth, taking care of God's creation, tending to the environment, leaving the planet better than how we found it, and not treating it like a rental car. But Paul talks about being stewards of God's mysteries, being caretakers of God's mysteries, conserving God's mysteries. Well, I'm not entirely sure I know what that means, but today I take that to mean that we're to live those mysteries and live with those mysteries. We're to recognize that there's more to God than what we proclaim, but also that our proclamation is a heartfelt announcement of what God has done in our lives. To see the Spirit of God hovering over our chaos, to preserve the story that we've been given in Jesus to be living sanctuaries of hope. And that's easy to forget as we make our way through our lives. Because it's my job to help you to be Christians in the world, how to make your faith matter, how to make our faith matter. Because I think being a Christian in today's world is tough, and it always has been. Not because of the atheists who make fun of us, or the tiny minority of folks who are hostile toward religion in general and Christianity in particular, or even our irrelevance to those who drive past our church on Sunday morning on the way to hockey practice. I think it's tough to be a Christian today because the world is so seductive. It's so easy to get sucked into grabbing with two hands what the world is offering. It's easy to forget who we are. It's easy to be servants of our appetites rather than servants of Christ, especially when our appetite is for money and what we think it can provide: comfort, security, pleasure, freedom, esteem, and power. It's what Jesus talked about when he said that we cannot serve two masters. We cannot serve God and wealth. It's either one or the other. We can't have it both ways, he says. But this hunger has been rumbling in our bellies since forever and demands to be satisfied, despite all warnings from God not to feed that beast. It's not that God doesn't like money. It's not filthy lucre that God is worried about. It's that God doesn't like what money can do to us. When I was in Halifax, as pastor in Halifax, a recently widowed member of the congregation donated a substantial sum to the church in memory of her husband. The council received it with thanks. But then we spent hours debating, actually fighting, over what to do with it. Then other members of the congregation chimed in. It must go to the endowment, they said. We need to tithe the money to Canadian Lutheran World Relief. The money's got to go to the building fund. And on it went for months, voices rising and along with people's temperatures. Then the woman who donated the money said, "It's my money. I'll decide how it's spent." "It's my money," she said. "My money." And God wept at the sight of this sad spectacle. As servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries, we failed bitterly, falling into the tempter's snare. Not a tempter with a pitchfork and red pajamas, but a tempter with a dollar sign stamped on his forehead. The mystery that we were called to steward wasn't just the generous donation, but also the relationships within the community. I often think about that troubled time in the congregation and wonder what made good, faithful Christians, servants of Christ, and stewards of God's mysteries start to behave like greedy little children. And I came to the conclusion that it's because we are both at the same time, in the same person and in the same people. We do serve two masters. We are good and faithful Christians, and we're greedy little children. That's the reality. We can't escape that. We have dual citizenship. We are citizens of heaven and taxpayers on earth. That is who we are. But God has a way of making us more than who we are. Because after fighting for months over the donation, and the donor threatening to take the money back, and after our council chairperson called a special prayer meeting, and after much prayer and discernment, it was agreed that the money would go to remodel the nursery. So a group of moms and a token dad, yes me, got together with a fancy interior designer to figure out what to do with a room that had peeling paint, 50-year-old toys, torn hand-me-down furniture, and a broken crib. Like most church projects, this job took twice as long as it needed to. But the result was stunning. It's amazing what fresh paint, a new carpet, a few leather couches, and a box of new toys can do. So gone were the institutional gray walls, and up came an oddly alluring cucumber green. The nursery rivaled the sanctuary for being the most beautiful room in the church, and in fact, I stopped meeting people in my office, directing them instead to the nursery. This makeover was also symbolic of something new that was happening in the church. The remade nursery told the congregation and to everyone who came through our doors that we trusted God's future, that this nursery will be well used. We anticipate growth. We anticipate children and lots of them within our church. And it reminded us that God can and does have a way of changing hearts and bringing people back together. That God transformed the fights of the past and the present into a hope for God's promised future. Because every time we walked past that room or stuck our head in that door, we were reminded that God is still making all things new, that God is still in the business of restoring broken relationships, that God is still recreating the world. Because at the church, as Christians, we may have moments when we forget that we are servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries. There will be times when our appetites take over and we forget who we are. There may be moments when it slips from our minds that we can't serve two masters. But God doesn't forget. God remembers God's promises. God remembers who you are. And out of something ugly and hurtful, God creates something beautiful and loving. The Christians in Corinth learned that freedom came not from what they can create for themselves on their own, but from what God was creating in them. The church in Halifax learned that even when they forget that serving two masters will leave them bitter and broken, God is still putting things back together. So for us as servants of God and stewards of God's mysteries, even when one door of opportunity is closed, we make our faith matter by remembering daily who we are, that we belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. God still has a promised future for us, a future with hope. So may we be found trustworthy when God reopens the door of possibility. May we steward God's mysteries with faithful love. May we serve Christ with joy, because that is who we are, and that is who we are becoming. And may this be so among us. Amen.